In one of our previous videos on clone defects, we discussed undesirable and desirable clone mutations or defects and concluded that the Kaminoan cloners were not entirely opposed to experimenting with mutated clones, if it meant they could improve their product. With that said, we can make inferences about how the Kaminoans envisioned the perfect clone, and in this video we're going to do just that, though we're also going to take what we learnt in our video on clone defects and discuss why it was so difficult to reach perfection. Yes, watching our video on clone defects before watching this one is definitely a good idea.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
While producing the perfect clone was a delicate thing, a bit of a Jenga tower, there was one factor which influenced the attributes of a perfect clone more than anything else, and that was what the customers wanted. At the end of the day, Kaminoan cloning was a for-profit organization, and if their customers weren't getting what they wanted, they would request a change or take their business elsewhere. In this way, the Kaminoans were limited with the clones of Jango Fett. The clones needed to serve a purpose, and that purpose was warfare, on the surface at least. So in this context, the perfect clone was just the perfect soldier, replicated millions upon millions of times. With this in mind, the questions become, how did the Kaminoans envision the perfect soldier, and why was it difficult for the Kaminoans to perfect their soldiers? Let's break it down into physical and mental factors. In terms of the clones' physical attributes, there was a reason Count Dooku and Darth Sidious chose Fett to be their genetic template. Sidious believed him to be one of the deadliest mercenaries and bounty hunters in the galaxy, and still by Sidious's logic, therefore a physically superior human. So generally, if a clone was a 6-foot-tall Kiwi dude with the strength, dexterity, and constitution to match that of the OG bounty hunter, it was a good start. Indeed, a few of the Fett template's physical attributes needed to be modified, though the modifications that were made improved the clone's stamina, reaction times, lung capacities, and eliminated minor disabilities such as allergies and astigmatism. Other than that, the only other physical attribute the Kaminoans programmed into the average clone was an accelerated growth rate, approximately double that of the average human being. With that said, just because the average clone trooper had these physical attributes doesn't mean they were the attributes of the perfect soldier, and the Kaminoans at least considered improvements. As we discussed in our video on clone defects, the Kaminoans allowed the clones of the Bad Batch to survive their gestation period and youth into Poker City because they wished to see their effectiveness. It was an experiment. The Bad Batch clones weren't all 6-foot-tall Kiwi dudes with the exact same face, and their physical abilities definitely exceeded those of the average clone. What this meant is the Kaminoans knew there was room to improve. For instance, why would the perfect soldier need to breathe at all? And forget switching off astigmatism, why wouldn't the perfect soldier feature thermal or X-ray vision? Why wouldn't they at least have the exceptional vision of Crosshair, the extra senses of Hunter, and the strength of Wrecker? Why wouldn't they reach maturity in a quarter or an eighth of the time? Why wouldn't their skin deflect blaster fire? Our point is, the physical attributes of the average clone could always have been improved, and again, the Kaminoans were aware of this. While it was easy to conceive making a clone stronger, faster, tougher, and more aware of their environment, a clone's mental configuration was a little more difficult to grasp, and reaching an optimal configuration was a far more delicate process. The average clone soldier was loyal, obedient, disciplined, aggressive, but not too aggressive, and independent, but not too independent. The latter, a propensity for independent thought, however, did vary between the average clone soldier, clone officers, and other clone variants. As for loyalty, obedience, and discipline, the perfect soldier could never have too much, though aggression and independent thought were fragile things, and most clone incidents could be traced back to a little too much or a little too little of these things. While we covered some great examples of these in our video on clone defects, we didn't get our Dorito-stained fingertips on the Null class Advanced Recon Commandos at all, so let's do that now. The Null class Advanced Recon Commandos were the first 6 clones of Jango Fett which were ultimately deemed a failure and discontinued, and the reason they were discontinued can be attributed to an imbalance in their mental attributes. While they were generally more intelligent, and while they had better memory and perception, they were also way too independent and, as a result, too creative, erratic, and unpredictable. In the words of Kaminoan scientist Urun Wa, the Null-class advanced recon commandos were highly intelligent, deviant, disturbed, and uncommendable. And to prove the point, when Urun Wa expressed his disappointment in the clones, he was almost blasted by Null-11, Auto Scarada. While the Null-class advanced recon commandos were a great example of an imbalance in the mental attributes leading to an undesirable situation, an imbalance could also lead to a desirable situation. Remember, clone officers were programmed to be more independent than the average clone, and in general, clones needed a certain degree of independence to be distinct from droids. That was their advantage. An example of a desirable situation was the Kamino Uprising. Here, the post-Order 66 501st Legion decimated the anti-troopers conjured by the empire-phobic Kaminoan clone masters to liberate Kamino. The reason why they were made piss, despite having special armor, special jetpacks, and special training, was that the 501st had experience and a far greater propensity for independent thought. They were once commanded by Rex, after all, whereas the anti-troopers were likely just kitted out clones of the average variety. Speaking of Rex, he sits on the fence here, with his exceptional propensity for independent thought both being a huge asset for the Republic during the Clone Wars, and a problem for the Empire during the Great Jedi Purge, prior to which he removed his inhibitor chip. So far, we've established the Kaminoans were limited by what their customers wanted, that they knew there was always room to improve their clones physically, and that they knew balancing their clones' mental attributes was a very difficult thing. A little like Goldilocks' porridge dilemma. But why didn't the Kaminoans improve their clones physically, advancing them perhaps to the level of Null-class advanced recon commandos, or even the Bad Batch? It is very likely this came down to a range of complex factors, such as detrimental interactions between genes, though it may also have come down to a lack of knowledge and resources. The same limitations may also have applied to advancing the physical attributes of the clones even further than the levels of the Null and the Bad Batch. The Kaminoans, even with the backing of the Republic and later the Empire, may not have had the knowledge and resources to bring to fruition their vision of a perfect soldier. Another factor holding the Kaminoans back from creating the perfect soldier we must consider may also have been the genetic template itself. Really, why was Jango Fett chosen and not somebody else? He was skilled, but if the Kaminoans had their way, they might have chosen someone else, perhaps not even a human. But again, this was the request of the customer, and the customer is always right. So, in conclusion, the Kaminoans would have likely advanced their soldiers as far as their knowledge and resources allowed physically, but they always had to consider what their customers wanted, and they always had to find the Goldilocks zone when it came to the mental attributes of aggression and independent thought. Loyalty, obedience, and discipline, on the other hand, could always be intensified. To reiterate, the Kaminoans' idea of a perfect soldier may have been very different from Sidious's idea of a perfect soldier. Though, as long as the Kaminoans were satisfying the wants of their customers, the clones they were producing were, in a way, perfect. Perfect for that job, perfect for satisfying Sidious. And that leads us to one last thing we must consider. And yeah, we sort of covered it in our video on clone defects. As a change in an environment cannot always be predicted, it's almost impossible to say which mutations or attributes may become favorable. This same logic can be applied to creating the perfect soldier. See, there is no tool that can be used for every job, and as soon as you try and make a multi-tool, each tool on it becomes a little shittier at the job it was made for. The point is, there's no such thing as a perfect tool or a perfect soldier. Everything has a weakness, except for Jedi Nicolas Cage, and attributes which are undesirable in some circumstances may be desirable in others. To reiterate, even if the Kaminoans had limitless knowledge and resources, they could never have created one clone template perfect for every job. But what are your thoughts? Do you have any theories on what the Kaminoans' perfect clones might have looked like, even if it wasn't truly perfect? Can you think of any other limitations faced by the Kaminoans in creating the perfect clone? Do you think Nicolas Cage is better suited to being a Sith than a Jedi? Please let us know in the comment section below. And just before you go, guys, make sure you check out all those juicy links in the description below waiting for your clicks. We have our Geetsly's Gaming Network with our Gary's Mod and our Roblox, our main Geetsly's Discord server, and a Patreon if you want to help support the channel. Anyways, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.